All right, so you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, great, because this one's a biggie. We're talking about constitutional rights and whether those rights stop at a nation's borders.
The classic dilemma. Where do individual rights end and national sovereignty begin? Especially in a crisis. That's when things get really interesting.
Exactly. And to make things even juicier, we've got this incredible mix of sources to work with. Excerpts from the Canadian and U.S. constitutions.
A draft of a UK constitution too, right?
So got it. Plus a glimpse at both the current German constitution and its predecessor from the Weimar era. Talk about a historical perspective.
I'm really curious to see how these different countries with their unique histories and values approach this whole question of rights.
Me too. Okay, so let's start with Canada. I don't know about you, but when I was going through the Canadian Constitution, I was kind of surprised by how much of it focused on the mechanics of government.
Yeah, it's very detailed about the structure of Parliament, the Senate, the division of powers between the federal government and the provinces, almost like a blueprint for how the country is supposed to run.
Right. But, and this is important, within all that, we find the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that's where things get interesting. Like, for example, the Charter specifically mentions affirmative action programs designed to help disadvantaged groups.
It's almost as if Canada is acknowledging that just stating everyone has equal rights isn't enough. You need to actually work to level the playing field.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, okay, we're going to put these rights in writing, but we also recognize that certain groups might need extra support to actually exercise those rights. What do you think about that?
I think it's a really interesting aspect of the Canadian approach. It suggests a recognition that historical inequalities can prevent people from truly having equal opportunities, even if those rights are technically guaranteed.
Yeah, it makes you think, huh? And another thing that stood out to me about the Charter was the emphasis on language rights, specifically English and French.
Of course, Canada's officially bilingual.
Right, we know that. But seeing it woven into their constitution like that, it really highlights how central that duality is to their national identity.
It's a reminder that a country's specific history and social makeup play a big role in how they define and protect rights. What works in one context might not translate directly to another.
Okay, but before we leave Canada, there's this one phrase in the Constitution Act of 1867, Section 91. It gives Parliament the power to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada.
Peace, order, and good government. Sounds pretty broad, doesn't it?
Right. Like in a crisis, could that be used to justify limiting individual rights in the name of national security? That's what I'm wondering.
That's a great question. And honestly, it's one that legal scholars have been debating for years. That phrase, peace, order, and good government, has been interpreted in a bunch of different ways.
I bet.
Some argue it gives the government really broad powers, especially during emergencies, to restrict certain rights if they believe it's necessary to, keep things stable and secure.
So even in a country like Canada, which has a pretty strong reputation for upholding human rights, there's still this built-in tension, this potential for those rights to be limited if things get really tough.
It seems that way. It really highlights a fundamental question that all these constitutions have to grapple with. How do you reconcile individual rights with the need to maintain order and security when everything's going sideways?
It's a tough one, for sure. All right, so we've got Canada with its blend of structural details and enshrined rights. Now let's head south to the good old US of A. What struck me about the U.S. Constitution is how much emphasis it puts on individual liberties right from the start, especially with the Bill of Rights.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. Constitution is definitely coming from a more individualistic perspective compared to the Canadian one, which starts by focusing on, governing. But it's interesting to note that both explicitly guarantees certain rights while leaving others open to interpretation.
Right, like the right to privacy isn't explicitly mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, but the Supreme Court has interpreted it to exist. And that due process clause in the Fifth Amendment, which basically says the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law, that seems like a big deal.
The Due Process Clause is, without a doubt, a cornerstone of American law. And it's been used to protect a ton of different rights, from freedom of speech to having a fair trial.
Does that offer stronger protection than what we see in Canada, though? Or does it just create more ambiguity because it relies so heavily on the courts to figure things out?
That's a really tough one. Both systems have their pluses and minuses, right? The U.S. relies a lot on judges interpreting the Constitution, which can lead to changes over time and different interpretations from different courts. On the other hand, the Canadian Charter is more specific on some things, but there's still room for interpretation.
True. And we can't forget about the amendment process in the U.S., which is how they've expanded rights over time, like voting rights. But as we all know, it's not exactly easy to change the U.S. Constitution.
It's by design, right? The amendment process is meant to be a challenge. It's there to protect against impulsive changes. But it also means that adapting to new social norms or addressing injustices can be a really long and difficult process.
Okay, so we've got Canada and the U.S., two very different approaches, but both wrestling with this balance between individual rights and the needs of the state. Now, let's jump across the pond. What's going on in the U.K. and Germany?
Well, one of the fascinating things is how the historical experiences of these countries have really shaped how they think about rights. The draft UK Constitution, for instance, is interesting because it proposes explicitly listing out a bunch of rights, including some that are often called positive rights.
Hold on. Before we go any further, let's break that down for our listeners. Positive rights. What are those? How are they different from the kind of rights we see in the U.S. Constitution?
Okay, good point. Think of this way. Negative rights, like those in the U.S. Bill of Rights, are basically freedoms from the government messing with you. Freedom of speech, for example, means the government can't tell you what you can and can't say.
Got it. Hands off.
Right. But positive rights are different. They actually require the government to do something to make sure you have certain basic things. So, like, the right to health care would be a positive right. It means the government has to actually provide healthcare services. The UK's draft constitution includes some of these positive rights, which shows a slightly different philosophy about what the government should be doing to ensure its citizens are well taken care of.
Okay, that's really helpful. So UK, lots of listed rights, some positive, some negative. And then there's Germany. I was struck by how much their constitution emphasizes human dignity as the foundation for all rights.
And rightfully so, given their history, right? The German Basic Law, that's what they call their constitution, is a really powerful example of a country coming to terms with a deeply traumatic past. You know, the horrors of the Nazi regime.
Absolutely.
And that emphasis on human dignity is everywhere in their constitution. It's in the limitations on state power. It's in the absolute ban on capital punishment, which makes a strong statement about the inherent value of every single human life.
It's a reminder that constitutions aren't just abstract legal documents. They're products of a nation's struggles, its values, its hopes for the future. Oh, and speaking of history, did you see that part in the Weimar Constitution? Germany's pre-Nazi constitution. It explicitly separated church and state.
Fascinating, right? The Weimar Republic was trying to break from the past to establish a more secular and democratic state.
Yeah, it makes you realize how different historical and cultural contexts can influence a nation's approach to rights. So we've got these four countries, Canada, the US, the UK, and Germany, all approaching this whole idea of rights in their own unique ways. But now let's bring it back to our original question. What happens when those rights bump up against each other at borders? Like in a crisis, whose rights take priority? The person seeking refuge or the citizen who might be feeling anxious about change?
That's when it gets really, really tricky. Imagine this scenario. A huge migrant crisis erupts. Thousands of people fleeing desperate situations, trying to find safety in another country. How do these different constitutions, with their different approaches to rights, handle something like that?
Well, the Canadian Charter does guarantee certain rights to everyone in Canada, regardless of their citizenship status. But remember that phrase we talked about earlier, reasonable limits. That could come into play during a crisis.
Exactly. And in the U.S., with its focus on individual liberties, you can definitely see how there could be some serious tension between protecting the rights of citizens and upholding the human rights of those seeking asylum. It forces us to ask some hard questions about what our values really mean in practice.
And then you've got the UK's draft constitution with those positive rights we talked about. They might be more inclined to consider the needs of migrants, but they'd also have to balance those needs with the concerns of their own citizens. It's a tough spot to be in.
For sure. And then there's Germany. Given their history, they might be more open to welcoming those fleeing persecution, but they'd still have to figure out how to manage the practical challenges of a sudden influx of people. There are no easy answers here, and every country has to find its own way.
So what are we saying here? Is there no perfect solution when it comes to balancing the rights of citizens and migrants, especially when things get tough?
It seems that way. Each constitution offers a framework, a set of guidelines, but applying those guidelines in a messy real-world situation is never straightforward. It takes a lot of careful thinking and a willingness to make tough choices.
This has been an amazing discussion so far. We've covered so much ground. We've looked at constitutions from all over, and we've started to untangle this whole issue of rights and borders. But there's still a lot more to talk about, right?
Absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface.
Okay, so everyone listening, stay with us. This deep dive is far from over.
Diving deeper into these constitutions, it really hits you that it's not just about the words on the page. It's about what a society chooses to prioritize, what they value.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, it's not enough to just read the Constitution. We have to understand the context, the history, the social and political stuff that shaped it.
Exactly. Like, take the U.S. Constitution. It was written at a time when the very idea of individual freedom was radical. So it makes sense that it focuses so much on protecting people from the government overstepping its bounds.
But wouldn't that same focus on individual freedom make it harder to, justify limiting rights, even temporarily if there's a crisis, for the sake of national security or something?
That's the tension, right? The Bill of Rights sets a really high bar for the government to intervene in people's lives.
Right.
But it does acknowledge that there might be extreme situations like a rebellion or an invasion where some rights might need to be put on hold.
Oh, okay.
The question then becomes, who decides when those situations happen? And how do we make sure those limits on rights don't go too far?
Yeah, that's where it gets messy. Because we're not just talking about theories here. We're talking about real people, real fears, and, real consequences.
Absolutely. Think about it. You have people fleeing a war zone. They're desperate for safety, for a chance at a new life.
Yeah.
Their survival might depend on crossing a border. But then on the other side, you might have citizens who are worried about what a large influx of people will mean for them, for their communities.
So how do you even begin to balance those competing interests? How do you weigh the rights of someone seeking refuge against the anxieties that might exist within society?
It's a challenge every nation has to face. And it's not a new problem either. This has been going on for centuries.
It's funny you say that. When I was reading the German Constitution, I was struck by how much it's shaped by their history, especially the horrors of the Nazi era.
Right. The German Basic Law is like a blueprint for how not to let history repeat itself. That emphasis on human dignity, the limits on state power, the total ban on capital punishment, it all reflects a determination to never let something like that happen again.
But even with a constitution that prioritizes human dignity so strongly, wouldn't Germany still face some really hard decisions in a crisis? Could they, for example, turn away asylum seekers, even if it meant sending them back to a dangerous situation?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. The German Basic Law does guarantee asylum for people persecuted on political grounds.
Okay.
But like most rights, it's not absolute. There are exceptions, and those exceptions can be interpreted in different ways depending on the political climate and social pressures.
So even in a country like Germany, which has such a strong commitment to human rights, there's still this potential for those rights to be limited or compromised in extreme circumstances.
It's the reality, unfortunately. These are complex situations. Constitutions give us a framework, a set of principles, but actually applying those principles in the real world is rarely clear-cut. It takes judgment, compassion, and a willingness to make tough calls.
As we're talking, I keep thinking back to that phrase in the Canadian Constitution, peace, order, and good government. It seems to capture this tension we're talking about, how the desire for order and security can sometimes clash with protecting individual rights.
That's it, exactly. And the challenge for any society is to find that balance where you have security without sacrificing freedom, and where people's rights are respected even when there's fear or uncertainty.
Okay, let's bring it back to our listeners for a second. As we've been going through these constitutions, what's jumping out at you? What questions are you grappling with?
Are there any parts that really resonate with you?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And as we continue this conversation, remember that constitutions aren't set in stone. They evolve, they're reinterpreted, and they're shaped by the ongoing discussions happening within a society.
That's so important, especially when we're talking about something as fundamental as human rights. Because at the end of the day, it's up to us as citizens to make sure those rights are upheld and protected, both within our own countries and beyond.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and assume the Constitution will do all the work for us. We need to be part of the conversation, to challenge assumptions, and to fight for a world where rights are truly universal, no matter who you are or where you come from.
Okay, so let's recap. We've seen how different countries approach this question of rights, each with their own history and values. We've explored the push and pull between individual liberty and keeping things safe and secure. And we started to unpack how complicated this all gets in a globalized world where people are on the move.
And we've seen that while constitutions are super important, they don't give us simple solutions to these really challenging dilemmas.
Yeah, but that's okay. This deep dive isn't about finding easy answers. It's about asking the right questions, thinking critically, and recognizing that we all have a role to play in upholding human rights, both close to home and on a global scale.
And as we move into the final part of this episode, we're going to continue to unpack these complex issues. We'll look at how globalization makes it even more challenging to balance rights and security, and we'll explore whether there's potential for international cooperation to protect human rights across the globe. So stay tuned. There's a lot more to uncover.
You know, it's amazing how this idea of balance keeps popping up. We've been talking about these constitutions, Canada, the US, the UK, Germany, and it's like they're all trying to walk this tightrope between individual rights and what the government needs to do, especially when things get crazy.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. We've seen how each country tries to find that balance, based on their history, their values, all of that. But the thing is, these constitutions aren't just words on a page. They're constantly being tested, reinterpreted as new challenges come up.
And one of the biggest challenges today has got to be migration, right? How does that fit in with all this talk about constitutional rights?
Yeah.
If someone's running from danger, do they have a right to seek safety in another country? And if they do, how do you balance that with, the concerns of citizens who might be worried about what it all means?
That's a tough question, a really complex issue. There's the moral argument, helping those in need, offering refuge. That's a big part of international law, and it's reflected in a lot of these constitutions we've been looking at.
Right.
But then you also have to think about practical things, national security, the economy, whether a country can actually handle a big influx of people. Those are valid concerns too.
It's not just about being afraid of outsiders or anything like that. These are real issues that governments have to deal with. It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They want to help, but they also have to protect their own citizens.
Exactly. And that's where those limits on rights come in. Those reasonable limits in Canada, the emergency powers you see in other constitutions. Sometimes when there's a crisis, governments feel like they have to restrict certain rights, even basic ones, to keep things safe and orderly.
But then who gets to decide when it's okay to restrict those rights? And how do we make sure it doesn't get out of hand, that it doesn't erode the very freedoms those constitutions are supposed to protect?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and that's why it's so important to have strong institutions, independent courts, and open, honest discussions about these issues. Because at the end of the day, it's up to the people to hold their governments accountable, to make sure any limits on rights are really necessary and that they don't overstep.
So I guess what we're learning here is there's no easy answer when it comes to rights and borders. It's this ongoing conversation, this balancing act that every country has to figure out on its own.
It is, and it's a conversation that needs to happen with empathy, with understanding, with a willingness to see things from different perspectives, because this isn't just a legal issue, it's a human issue. It gets to the heart of what we value and how we treat each other, both at home and around the world.
That's a powerful thought. This deep dive has been incredible. We've learned so much about these constitutions, about the challenges of balancing rights and security, about what it means to uphold those rights in a world where we're all so connected.
And we've seen that even though there are no easy answers, that doesn't mean we should stop asking the questions.
Exactly. It's all about keeping those conversations going, staying engaged, and remembering that we all have a part to play in making sure everyone's rights are protected. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. We hope this has given you something to think about, maybe even spark some conversations of your own. Because ultimately, it's those conversations that will shape the future of human rights, both in our own communities and across the globe.